Perry Klebahn is the Director of Executive Education at the D School and an adjunct faculty professor at Stanford School of Engineering. He's a seasoned entrepreneur and a product designer, but despite his years of running startups and corporations, Perry's true calling is teaching, which is why we love to have him. It's so much fun. And then also with us today, we have Jeremy Utley. Jeremy is the Director of Executive Education at the D School and an adjunct professor at Stanford School of Engineering. He's also an outstanding collaborator and teaches many celebrated courses at Stanford. Gentlemen, it's always a pleasure. Thank you for being here with us today, and take it away.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Robin. We're thrilled to get to see everyone today. And we're excited to get started. This question, what is design thinking and why should I care, is something that we hear often at Stanford and in the world. And there's a great thing about design thinking becoming a popular term, which is that lots of people are curious about it. It's somewhat well known, but there's a downside, which is that all of a sudden it starts to seem special or inaccessible. And that's ironic for us because the goal of design thinking is actually to make the tools and mindsets and ways of thinking that have helped designers solve problems available to folks who don't consider themselves to be designers or maybe even don't consider themselves to be creative. So very simply, design thinking is a way of coming up with ideas and seeing whether they're any good, very simply. And it's meant to be not some specialized thing that's reserved for the chosen few, but a set of tools that can help anyone in any career, in any organization, in any role in the organization, be more effective at solving the problems you're tackling there. Whether those problems look like introducing a new product into the market, or crafting a sales pitch, or writing a subject line to an email, or designing an expense reimbursement process. We see all of those as opportunities for design thinking or for coming up with ideas and learning whether they're good ideas. Very simply, just to get started, we want to start with this quote by Linus Pauling. He said, to get a good idea, you need a lot of ideas. And that's something that very few people really appreciate. It's said so simply as only a two-time Nobel Prize winning chemist could say it, but it's actually profound. What the research indicates is that the single most important variable that affects how good your ideas are is how many ideas you have. And so while many people are really focused on coming up with better ideas, the truth is they should be coming up with more ideas. The way to get to better is actually to generate more. And what we would say is that design thinking is an exceptional idea generation methodology, to put it very simply. It's a great way to come up with a volume of ideas. And you may be familiar with a process visualization that we've used and popularized now about 10 or 15 years ago through a video that Perry and I made, and we released it on YouTube. It ended up being viewed, gosh, 500,000 or maybe even 1 million times. And so this visualization became very popular, probably more popular than it should have become, but it became a way to describe one way to think about what designers do, which is very simply, they empathize with people they're trying to design for, meaning they try to get to know them and understand their feelings and emotions, etc. Then they define a problem to be solved, meaning they start with that loose understanding of human beings and say, what problem really matters to those people? And then they ideate or they generate a bunch of potential solutions, and through a series of prototyping and testing, implement and refine and discover whether their ideas are any good. And the useful thing about this way of visualizing the process is it helps us put various tools that designers might use that we might recommend that anyone in any role might consider bringing into their problem-solving process. It helps us put them into buckets. That's been really great. The downside of us using this visualization is that a lot of people have taken design thinking as a recipe of sorts or a formula of sorts. And they assume that if you empty the powder into the bowl and then you add water and then you beat it and add an egg, that all of a sudden a cake's going to come out. And so it's a little bit misleading insofar as it looks like a linear sequence of events that has a clear beginning and an end point. It's more a set of mindsets. And so rather than talking about a fixed process per se, what we thought would be fun to do is actually introduce design thinking by way of a story. Because we have the incredible privilege of getting to interact with some of the most innovative individuals and innovative organizations, and even organizations that don't really seem innovative, but they're employees actually are, and they're doing really cool things. And we hear a bunch of great stories, and we feel that we're stewards of those stories. And we have the opportunity to showcase how a mindset of a designer leads to breakthroughs and leads to realizations and meaningful impact in human beings' lives. So we want to tell quickly the story of our friend Bill Pacheco, who has had a very illustrious career, not only as an engineering leader at Cybex, but also as a director at Keurig Dr. Pepper, and he now teaches at Trinity College. Most importantly, though, I like to think that the most important organization he's involved with is Perry's Nightmare, where he is my doubles partner in tennis. And we like to give Perry a hard time on the tennis court. But Perry, would you like to tell the story of Bill and his incredible innovations?
Yes. So pleasure. Just to clarify on the tennis, front there, there's another partner involved. I have a doubles partner. Logan may be on the group right now. Logan Deans and I. Bill gets a lot of practice these days as he and his brother play all the time. So anyway, and I'm pretty busy here, Bill. So anyway, Bill also teaches at BU now as well. So Boston University. Terrific fellow, and it's such a pleasure. One of the great things about doing the work we do is actually being able to not only talk about alumni of the programs, but use these live examples. And this is something great about the programs we put together is it's just terrific to, with LinkedIn, and hear stories from you all and see how you're using the tools we teach, and it actually drives a lot of the changes. Bill, for example, the story I'm about to share with you, a lot of the techniques we use in prototyping, that one step Jeremy talked about, have come from the direct work with Bill Pacheco. So with that, we'll talk about it. So for those of you that the two companies mentioned, Keurig is a coffee company. It has those capsules. You may, if you've stayed in a hotel or been to, an airport or whatever, there's capsules, and they have this neat technology. He was did the product design there for a period of time with the team. And also earlier in his career, when we met him, he was working at a company called Cybex. If you've been on a treadmill machine, if you've been on an elliptical trainer, a stationary bicycle, they're one of the major suppliers of equipment like that. And chances are you've been on something actually Bill's designed if you've been to a hotel gym and actually used anything, or a big corporate gym. So with that, wanted to go and talk a little bit, so we're going to dive a little bit deeper on. So what we're going to tell is a story of Bill using design thinking as a way to sort of bring life to the steps that Jeremy spoke about, and actually be able to talk to you about what this looks like in real life, okay? And I think that's a big component of what we're passionate about with this program is we cover all aspects of design thinking, how you might use it in teams, and how you might use it in a larger organization, which is what this story is about. So here's Cybex. Cybex is part of a group of competitors making products. And we're going to talk a little bit about treadmills. So treadmills, the thing you hop on top of and you run and you actually use for a workout, okay? So these are their competitors. So at the time we sort of click into this was about 10 years ago, probably, Bill was doing this kind of work. And these are the competitors. And they're, like any company, they're sort of duking it out with these people, fighting for market share. And Bill, having had, training in design thinking, went to a gym and actually used some of the techniques of empathy. That first stage is you sort of open up your brain, you observe, you maybe inquire and actually talk to folks, asking more open-ended questions, but you leave yourself open to inputs. So there's many different techniques. This is a good example of observation. So what Bill did was he took his notebook, spent a while, and just stayed and watched. And what he noticed, you can tell he shared these pictures. You can see these folks if you just go in close to your screen. You'll see these amazing machines that have, all this terrific technology and these monitors, all this stuff. People are holding on to all the screens and holding on to things for dear life. And you got the sense there's something more going on here than I'm aware of. This is, and something we seek to understand in those early stages of design thinking is understanding emotions of the users. He didn't measure, how long are people on the treadmill? How much do they, talk about it? It wasn't data collection. He was really looking at faces. And what he noticed was the emotion that was fear. what he noticed was people were afraid on these machines. And he thought, oh my God, that's super interesting to understand and use that to launch into design thinking and begin to understand why they might be feeling fear and take a sort of a very open perspective to that. So as he talked to folks and began to understand, he developed some ideas around basically changing the structure around these products. So keep in mind now, he's part of an organization, Cybex. He has a boss. And this is a category of product that the assumption was, like many products, it's pretty much set. There's a treadmill you run on. There's a screen. We've got lots of competitors. There's much better things, Bill could be working on. So he sort of did some quick drawings. He sort of said, I'm gonna try to make a machine that deals with this aspect of fear and maybe gives people more places to hold on to. He did some quick prototypes. He did some quick drawings. And like we all do, he went to his boss and he showed it to him. And this is the note he got back. So those of you who can't read it, says he did this presentation and showed, there's a picture behind this that's hidden, but it's a prototype with these PVC pipes that he sort of built out quickly, which is a technique of rapid prototyping. So he's got this insight about fear. He's done some work to build something. He's got some ideas, and his boss, Ray, says, I'm not a fan of anything in this presentation. So part of what we see as folks use these tools and techniques in the organization is they're new. And part of what Jeremy actually does a component with another collaborator from Stanford, Justin Farrell, about how you might think about approaching this organizations. This was a typical response is, there's nothing to do with treadmills. Treadmills are a safe business. His boss wanted him to move on and do something else. What he knew was Bill knew he had a great insight. He knew the end user was afraid. He knew there needed to be changes. He could tell there was an opportunity to sort of pursue this further. So what he did was he went a step further, and he actually decided to take a little bit of extra time, not a huge amount of time, but built up some really quick prototypes and began to sort of put these extra railings on and these things that were sort of designed very, very differently to allow people points of connection to the machine that weren't about the electronics and weren't about things that were not intended for that purpose, which is what he saw before. And he did a really interesting thing that as you get to the design process, he noticed something in empathy, this idea of fear. He framed it up and said, I'm going to build a machine that addresses these points of stability and these fear points and what drives that fear. He ideated, came up with a bunch of ideas. That was that presentation. He did one step further. He said, hey, I'm going to prototype and test. And that's a great way to validate, to say, I'm going to put this out there for just a little bit and see how the user responds to it. So his idea was to show his boss ultimately some information from that prototype and test cycle, which is what we espouse. So he went out, he put these really rough prototypes. They look really polished, but he's literally welding little bars onto them and making them look good. He took them to a hotel gym, and he measured how many people picked the machine with these new, rails and new sort of ergonomics, how many people picked the existing machine. They were just side by side. And he got really good data. And something we espouse with our students is, how do you actually put something out in the world and use it to make sure you validate it? Not only validated the problem, Jeremy talked about there's sort of two things going on. He definitely validated by people picking one or the other. There's something to the aspect of fear. They look at that machine and they say, no, they want this one. And then he would talk to people after using it and see what their experience was like and get that data. That data allowed him ultimately to put something into market. So this was a success financially. Great for the company, great outcome. But more so, what Bill knew was he was solving a real human need, which is at the core of what we teach with design thinking. Is too often we sort of walk through life accepting an existing problem statement. A lot of business problem statements might be around how do we increase revenue or how do we sell more? And the reframe that happened with Bill was he learned, hey, for our products, there's this emotion, fear, and I'm going to actually use that to design and ultimately design a far better product. And it's a great outcome and a terrific product. And if you see it in the marketplace, you'll know all the backstory of where it came from. But I think a good example of running through that entire cycle of design. It's
an amazing story. And there's some amazing comments happening in the chat too. Someone mentioned, let's see, Ray said, wait, you're telling me that he took action and made a prototype even after his boss said he didn't like it? And what we'd say is there's really two really important things there that are worth unpacking just in response to that question, right? Or that realization, right? Because a lot of us go, my boss said he hates it, so it's done. But design thinking is really useful, and it relates to Vivian's point around the pandemic of trust as well. Design thinking puts us in such close proximity to the people that we're designing for or we're trying to innovate for. And it could be a human being in a gym. It could also be an employee who's the recipient of an HR policy, or an employee who's trying to file their expense reimbursements, or it could be any one of those things, right? So we don't mean to only limit this way of thinking to new product introductions. But the point is, using a designer's mindset, one of the things we advocate is getting close to the people whose lives you're hoping to impact by your work. And what happened for Bill is he got conviction that people were afraid. People felt unsafe. And as he's watching and interacting with people in gyms, that conviction grew. There's a need for a perception of safety here that I feel is a real human need, a real human pain that deserves to be met. And I think, and we've seen that countless times with many individuals inside organizations, the senior management will say, to our friend Doug Dietz, who pioneered an incredible innovation at GE with a pediatric device, the senior leadership at the time said, there's very few pediatric wards in the United States. Don't waste your time on this. But just like Bill, Doug had engaged with the people whose lives he was trying to improve with design, and he felt their pain strongly enough to ignore what his bosses said effectively. And one of the amazing things about design is all of a sudden, you can quickly become the resident expert in the people's lives who you're hoping to transform with your work efforts. And so that's the first thing. The second thing is, and I think it's also related to Ray's question about, wait, Bill just pushed through even though his boss said no? What he realized is his boss is reacting to an idea, but he has no information. He doesn't understand. There's no way to contextualize the idea other than according to his own past history. And what Bill realized, and what's really magical, is part of the design mindset is saying, really quickly, I can actually create data. Our organizations love data, and we think about looking up data and looking up research reports. But what designers are doing, or what individuals who don't consider themselves creative or designers before, but who are using these tools, that's who we're calling designers. What designers do is they're actually finding clever ways to create new data sets, which help them make better decisions. And as Perry mentioned, when Bill put the couple of prototype units inside of a hotel, he was able to watch people vote with their feet. And so even though Ray's got 65 patents in the space, and even though he thinks it's a bad idea, he can't deny the fact that when 30 people walked into the gym, 28 of them chose this machine. Why did they choose it? That really validated the sense of fear that Bill had picked up on, right? And so it's that kind of enlightened trial and error that we're advocating, where you're really deeply connecting with the people whose lives you're hoping to change. And then you're willing, humbly, to be learning whether you've got it right or not. And if Bill had implemented it and it didn't go well, I think he would have given up the hunt, or he would have found a different way to go about trying to convey a sense of safety. But the point is not insubordination. The point is thoughtful care about how do we impact the people whose lives we are trying to impact, and how can we help stimulate our own thinking. As we said at the beginning with this Linus Pauling quote, we need a lot of ideas. And there's some research that indicates that the average corporate brainstorm generates 2 ideas, just 2. And so what design thinking does is it helps teams overcome that tendency to settle very, very quickly. But we mentioned before that this way that we've been describing the design process is a little bit outdated. And so what we thought would be fun to do before we dive into some more of these questions here, and Perry, maybe you can be looking at the questions and seeing if there's anything that we want to start with. But we thought it'd be useful to say how we think about describing the process now. If it's not these 5 colorful hexagons, how do we describe it now? And what we'd say is very simply, design thinking has made an advance on conventional problem solving, where conventional problem solving basically is this. A boss says, implement this solution. They hand you a grain of sand. They hand you an idea on a Post-it. Do this, right? That's it. And what design thinking says, it makes 2 meaningful advances. The first advance that we advocate is we say, hang on, before we converge on one solution, let's diverge and let's generate as many possible ideas or ways to solve the problem that's been given as possible. So the first step is diverge before we converge, right? And that's an enormous advance over implement this solution. The other significant advance that we have made in the D School is that we've said, actually, let's recognize that there's two pieces to any problem-solving endeavor. And we think a lot about problem-solving, but let's stop for a second. Let's talk about problem-finding. Because really, implicit to any solution we're trying to implement is a problem that we think we want to solve. And what designers have become very adept at is being as clear about the problem they're trying to solve as they are about the solution that they're advocating. And just like with the solution, it's also an opportunity that we diverge, we generate lots of potential problems and ways of thinking about the problem, or framing, as we might say, before we converge. And it's useful to think that there's these two discrete outputs to a design effort, because a lot of times people just think about the answer. And what we would say is the question is every bit as important. John Dewey, the famous American educational reformer, said, a problem well put is half solved. And so a lot of the efforts that we spend in the design practice, and that you might spend if you're doing finance or HR or product development or marketing or content strategy, a lot of your time is actually spent framing a problem worth solving before you ever even undertake the tools to think about how you solve it. The goal ultimately is to get this high degree of alignment where you have a high degree of confidence that the problem that you've identified and the solution you've imagined overlap. And everybody's goal is that these things would overlap perfectly. It rarely happens that way in the beginning. More often than not, there's kind of a misfit, and there's not quite the right way to think about it. And so teams that get good at design are constantly assessing both of these things, the problem that they've articulated and the solutions they've imagined, and they're assessing their fit. And the way they assess their fit is by being clear about not only what they're working on, meaning right now we focused on the problem or we focused on the solution, but also how they're working, meaning are we generating options or are we making decisions? So if you think about that 2 by 2, there are 4 discrete buckets that we could draw from at any time to help us think about how we might advance our thinking. And when we talk about process now, a lot of times we talk in terms of these buckets because it's a little bit more useful, it's a little bit less prescriptive, it's a little bit less sequential, and it helps us capture. The goal is for any team to be able to be fluent about what kind of activity do I need to undertake right now to continue to advance my learning about the problem we're trying to solve or the way that we're trying to solve it. And so ultimately, we aren't looking for robots or automatons who can perfectly recite chapter and verse on the correct sequence of events, so much as individuals who have a fluency and a confidence and a capability around self-navigating. What am I working on right now? How should I be working? And what tools would be appropriate for me to draw upon next? That's how we like to think about process here. With that, I'll stop, and maybe Perry, have you seen a couple questions that we want to dive into?
Absolutely. So there's so Rick White in the middle of all this made a great comment, and I wanted to go back to it. So it's if yours are numbered, it's number 33. But it's a great comment, Jeremy, that sort of punctuates something you've been saying, and I think he wrote it better than you said it. Just got to call it out. There you go.
Love it. Love it.
He said, businesses seem to keep us focused on the product, parentheses, output. It seems like you are saying the creative process needs more inputs. And I would say I wish that we had, put that at the beginning as almost like a tenet for designers, which I very much agree is you're mindful of inputs. So in the story about Bill, he was mindful about inputs. He was mindful about going out and getting more content. He was sort of able to say, if I think about treadmills or think about the next project I'm going to work on, have I spent some time in a gym and just observed? Have I spent some time? Do I have some ideas about how people are feeling on some of the? And he may have gone there on a day when he noticed somebody on the stationary bicycle. It'd be a different story about a stationary bicycle, but he was mindful. I need some input, and as an individual, I know him to be that way now. he's mindful about his inputs and mindful about, am I spending time? You know, we give one of the components of the class is about daily practice and about techniques for you as an individual to build being mindful about inputs into your practice. But designers are seeking inputs to frame up interesting new questions. Sort of the whole other topic. But Bill found a really interesting problem because he was mindful of inputs. And then later on, when he said, "Hey, you know what? Maybe my boss needs is some other input to this project, which is some data, some information from testing to see what happens." And then there was a question I wanted to sort of tie in with this, which I thought was fascinating. So Jonathan LaPlante, number 38.
Yeah, I'm glad you pointed that one out. I was hoping for that one too.
I've tried the design thinking brainstorming method with a few business partners, and our issue is usually that we end up with a list of hundreds of ideas, which is great work, awesome. Some of them really good. But then we go back to the opportunity we had before the design thinking brainstorming session. Sadly, I find business partners will fall back on whatever seems like it is the easiest path, what they know and don't want to. So it goes on. But the idea is you're selecting when you use this process. So Bill sort of, in a way, that story, we tell the magical story of persevering and making it through that. And, getting to a very interesting outcome. What I love, Jonathan, is the honesty. So thank you for the comment. That one thing that's hard is, so many of the problems, we face, and I'm sure all of you face in your personal life, in your professional life, sort of the problem, presupposes this path. And, I think we come in and we say, design thinking, wander around and look at these things and dream up a new problem. And, the reality is, I love John that, well, that's super fun. And we did that and we generated a bunch of ideas, but then you come back in and we got to get stuff done here. We're done with the design part. We've got to select something, we've got to move forward with something that for sure solves this problem. And we'd say one of the things we espouse, and sort of if you think about design thinking as largely we're finding a problem and then we're solving that problem. There are two halves of the diagram, or on the screen right now, the two halves of what's happening there. We would say on the product side, on the production side, we espouse really, really rapid prototyping techniques. So taking an attitude of how can I spend just a little bit longer, or even shorten. If you're coming up with hundreds of ideas, Jonathan, I would say shorten your brainstorming time and leave time right then and there to build some of the ideas, to make some really rough prototypes, to keep alive some of the wilder ideas, and say we're going to suspend this sort of decision making, and we're just going to build out a couple of these and make them real. And we teach these very, very fast and simple, low-resolution prototyping techniques. And that's a fabulous skill to go through life with, is how do I build a quick prototype? This is something, Robin, who somebody was asking, what's the name of the person? Robin's been amazing in building the content of the programs. That's been the approach we've taken to building the courses, is how do we do something really, really quick, to Jeremy's point, put it up on YouTube, get some feedback, and then do another one that's completely different. And that's the way we approach it. Is the question I would be asking, Jonathan, is how do I do, 10 prototypes and do it so quickly and so efficiently that we can do that in minutes and get some concepts to be real, so we can actually have some data to evaluate? Because I think the thing that's missing is you can select an idea from that list that's doable for the business, but if you had a chance to compare it to some of the other ideas a little bit as you went further, you might have some data to move forward with.
Yeah, the other thing I would say there, just on that question, Jonathan, is if you don't have the opportunity to create something in the middle of the interaction, then another great thing you can do is you can at least schedule time for creating something later. We call that writing a love note to your future self, because a lot of times you realize we've got potential here, but we're out of time. We're about to rush to other meetings. If there's no ownership and there's no sense of when the follow-up is, then there's not going to be a new conversation unless there's new information. And a lot of times teams tend to kick these decisions down the road, or like you said, just default to what we already decided we wanted to do. And the only way to change that is if someone, at Amazon, they call them single-threaded ownership or single-threaded leaders, someone takes responsibility for it. So a great tactic is, as a leader, say, who's going to take this and run with this in the next week? When we meet next week, what are we asking about? Are we asking about, click-through rates, open rates, or like what do we want to know about? And then commission someone to actually create that data. And then the other thing we'd say is, what are they going to stop doing? You can't give somebody something new without also kind of drawing back some level of responsibility. So which 2 or 3 standing meetings do they not need to attend in the next week so that they can create that data? A lot of times it's almost like, I worked in India for a while, and there's what's known in India as the last mile problem. It's like, it's really difficult to penetrate to the last mile in rural areas, and that's where the majority of the population is. This is a last mile problem when it comes to operationalizing innovation. Ownership, what's the next step, what's the outcome, and a lot of times with nebulous new ideas, it's kind of nobody's job. And if you allow it to be nobody's job leaving a meeting, you shouldn't be surprised that nobody does anything, right? So to flip that script, you have to actually assign the work, and it's go with enthusiasm. Who's stoked on it? Who really wants to see? Who really wants to explore? Great, you're going to own it, and we're so excited to see the data next week in our next team meeting.
Yeah. The other one, so there's a bunch in here that follow up. So Ray, a quick question that I think follows up on that. What method do you suggest to sort out a lot of ideas? So the practical thing we actually teach is being mindful about selection process. So as you move from ideation, you're generating lots and lots of ideas, meaning you've found that emotional insight, as Bill did. He framed up a unique challenge. How do I make people not fearful of their experience on exercise equipment? He generated a lot of ideas. Then you might select. You might come up with more interesting selection criteria. Recently, another associate of ours, Dr. Catherine Segovia, who we teach with a lot, who's actually in the program here. She runs the practice component. We've been working with this medical company, and we've been talking to them a lot. They're generating all kinds of new ideas about this really interesting medical product. I can't go into details on it because it's all sort of super secret. And we've talked a lot about this topic of how do you select ideas? One selection criteria, if we want to go, back and talk about, Rick and Jonathan a little bit, you might just default to a selection criteria. What's within our budget? What can we do? But we've talked about being more mindful of selecting ideas. What could dazzle, the customer? What could make the customer, in Bill's case, what would make the customer feel incredibly safe? What would make the customer feel like they could start, immediately on this exercise device? Those might be selection criteria to sort through ideas. And there's no exact selection criteria, meaning what Jeremy and I do a lot in classes is we might take a group of ideas and select with one selection criteria. We might select with what do we think we could do on a tight budget? Great. There are a couple ideas that come to mind. Then we might take, a different color, dot or a different color Post-it and sort of put tabs on other ones. We might select which one would most likely delight the customer. Which one would actually deliver a unique experience versus our competitors. But the point is, we're slicing and dicing ideas with multiple selection criteria. And I think too often we move, as these folks talked about in those quite early questions, with a singular one. Like we've got to have a list, 1 to 100, this is the best, this is what we're going to start with. And what we espouse is mix it up. Try different selection criteria. And it's almost like you get a mosaic. Sometimes it looks like a heat map where we're selecting with so many different criteria and you've got all these different colors that mean different things on a group of Post-its that you can actually sort of see potentially multiple aspects of solutions and come up with this is maybe something we can talk about in another question as well, Jeremy, is this idea of building a portfolio. That I think another thing designers do is they think about having a portfolio of solutions. Not going to that single solution early on, but saying, how might I build a group of solutions? How might I select a bunch of different ideas based on different selection criteria? it leaves my options open, and it allows me to have different prototypes out there generating comparative data and helping me see the path forward out of vagueness to clarity. And that's what we always espouse. We have a class called D Leadership. And I think at different times, the teams are working on 2 or 3 problem statements, each was 2 or 3 prototypes. So that it gives them, it's a lot of work and a lot of confusion sometimes, and it gives them a lot of clarity as to a direction forward, if you will. That this idea of building multiple solutions, and the same thing with having multiple selection criteria.
I wanted to go to Ava Dobreva's, I hope I'm saying that right, Ava, question or comment. She said, customers don't know what they want. You can go ahead and ask them, right? As Henry Ford said, if I asked my customers what they wanted, they would have said a faster horse. She uses these examples. Do you need Amazon Prime? Do you need Facebook? Do you need Airbnb? So leaving them to come up with their needs based on the problems they have doesn't seem like the most efficient approach. And Ava, if whatever you're doing for your employment doesn't work out, please come and join our team at Stanford, because we couldn't agree more. We are not, human-centered design is not customer-led design. It's not taking instructions from the customer. Far from it. And you have to be careful to craft experiments, really, is what we would say. It's an experimental mindset that give you highly credible data. And in another one of our sessions, you may have seen this if you've seen many of our webinars, but it's worth just repeating very briefly, just taking this as a case study. January 2016, the executive team of Westfield Mall in downtown San Francisco is having an emergency meeting because tenants on their 4th floor are moving out of the 4th floor. Rents are falling, and they don't understand what to do. They've got a problem with foot traffic. Tenants keep saying not enough people are coming up here. And despite the beautiful frescoes and panoramic views of the city, it's not enough to drive foot traffic to the 4th floor and actually forestall the plummet of rent. And so they've got a crisis on their hands. They had a quick brainstorm. One of the ideas that came out of the brainstorm was we should put a beer garden on the 4th floor. Wouldn't that be amazing? You know, you think about startup founders coming up like Greek gods onto Mount Olympus and drinking ambrosia. It'd be wonderful. So thankfully, they thought we should at least ask people if they like this idea. They went down to the lobby, to the 1st floor, to the food court. If we built a beer garden on the 4th floor, gorgeous views, would you come? Something like 85% of people said yes. And so, Ava, to your chagrin, I'm sure, they spent quite a bit of money to build out this beer garden. And it won't surprise you, I know, Ava, to realize that months later, it was a colossal mishap. They hardly attracted any more foot traffic to the 4th floor. Rents continued to fall. Tenants continued to move out. And they were left scratching their heads saying, what did we do wrong, right? We brainstormed, we came up with ideas, we asked people what they wanted, and they brought us in to be a part of that post-mortem, so to speak. And one of the things that became clear is they had this great data, right? They talked to 1,000 people, 850 of them said, yes, if you build it, we'll come. And what we challenged them on was, it may be data, but not all data is created equal. And you ask people what they like, you know, I mean, I've been the puppy dog intern before myself saying, mister, would you sign up for a magazine? And you put me down for a nickel, buddy, you know? And people say yes, but it's not really an indication of what they'll do. And we worked with the team as they tried to solve the problem in the future, saying, how do we create environments and experiences and offers that yield more highly credible data? And you know, one of the simplest ideas that came out of this discussion, you can hire an hourly worker, put them at the top of the 4th floor escalator outside of the elevator bank, put a bunch of curtains up, right? Not do any of the actual remodeling work or renovation work. Give the intern, a pitcher of beer and a cactus, so it's a beer garden technically, and then put signs all over the mall saying, visit our beer garden on the 4th floor. It's like anytime somebody comes up, intern, pour them a beer, great, it's free. Where's the garden? Well, we're still working on it, but we're so glad you're here, right? Really quickly, if the intern with his third hand or her third hand is just kind of clicking how many people are coming up, really quickly they'd realize that value proposition wasn't driving foot traffic. And the big question is, when people become aware of an opportunity, do they hit the 4th floor button on the elevator? And that's what they should have been measuring. And because they said, if we did it, would you come? They gave people an opportunity to lie to them. Customers will lie to you, not because they're malicious, but because, one, they can't imagine the truth, and two, they don't want to tell the poor puppy dog intern with the clipboard no. It just doesn't feel good, right? So you have to design interactions that give you more highly credible data than survey information. So to all that say, just wanted to second what Dr. Eva Dobrova, Professor Emeritus, mentioned. Don't ask people what they want. We totally agree.
Yeah, and then you've also answered, I think, a couple other questions, Jeremy. Somebody asked, could you give an example of design thinking that doesn't involve engineering? I think it was Jessica, and then, which is great. So now you've given an example that involves beer drinking. And I'd say somebody else asked, I think it was Valerie, one of your questions about, hey, do you have to use this for a product, and can you use it for a process? And absolutely, you can use it for a process. I think that sometimes those examples, we pick something that's like, oh, this is clever, and a product tends to, go and we can sort of tell a quick story, and there's an output and there's a thing that it all goes into. Process, we have amazing alumni stories. I remember one that comes to mind was an executive from one of our programs in design thinking that went back to American Express and redesigned, the entire process for helping folks to get stuck in a big weather event. He noticed that, hey, one of the things that happens is all of our processes sort of break down in these big events, like the recent one, Hurricane Ida. People are delayed, stuck in airports. We don't have good solutions. And there's different techniques for it. We espouse a lot of improvisational activities. So if we're thinking about a product, Valerie, you and I are thinking about, hey, we have a different idea for a process. What if somebody called in and then they got this and then this happened? We might act it out. I might act like the customer and you might act like the process. Sounds weird, but I'd come in and say, hey, I'm Perry, I'm stuck in the airport. And then you would respond. You'd respond, we'd run through a scenario together. That would be one prototype. Then we try a different one. And we might even do that with then bringing in an actual outside user. And act as if it exists and run somebody through it with the minimum effort to sort of build anything. And a lot of times this results in sort of multiple flowcharts. So we might have a flowchart of one process and a flowchart of another and a flowchart of another. And we would sort of be able to compare which ones are faster, which ones result in outcomes that are favorable, which ones create new questions. We could again sort of look at those and evaluate them. But absolutely, process is a largely, actually, if I think about so many of the student projects now we deal with, process is becoming much more actually what we use it for. If I think about many of the projects going on in classes at Stanford.
I'm just trying to answer a bunch of questions as much as I can in the chat here. Looks like one link we shared at one point was broken. I'm trying to go in and tell people that it's fixed. So,
and I don't recall the question. Somebody also was asking a little bit about how to get teams to do this and how do you approach teams. And I would say one of the things, I'm scanning for the person's name as I look somewhere else here. But anyway, so if you could find Jeremy, it was earlier on. But in terms of application of teams, I think one of the big ideas with David Kelly and starting the design school is that students going through our programs have a consistent approach. And I think the biggest thing to bringing this into an organization is we see a lot of times teams have trouble when one person's ideating while the next person's trying to build a prototype, or somebody's trying to make a decision and converge while the other person, to Jeremy's point, is diverging and coming up with new ideas. And I think the teaching a consistent process to teams, if there's any sort of amazing, insight to what the D School's done at Stanford, is it's given language to students to have consistent process. And I see even a couple students even commenting here. Krish, I see on there on the questions. But I think they could comment as well if you ever talk to them. It's like, it's really cool to have a consistent understanding, because Chris, for example, is a student on there, is asked a question. He comes to a session on Wednesday mornings for this class we do, and he might be talking to an MBA student or a different student or something, but they have a consistent understanding of an approach and consistent language around it. So they can even comment on each other's work and dive in and help each other. And for teams working, that consistent understanding of a process is amazingly helpful. Particularly, think about the kind of work we're working on. It's uncertain work. Design is uncertain work. So in a way, it amplifies a lot of emotion. It amplifies a lot of the challenges with working with teams. And consistency of understanding, we're ideating right now, we're generating ideas. We'll make a decision at the end of that. We'll then prototype and test. We'll then evaluate the data from testing. It gives teams the ability to work effectively with a consistent approach to problem solving. And if there's one sort of tenet with this, is we have seen it really, really effective if a team has a consistent approach to a problem solving technique.
Do we have time for more questions, you think, Perry, or should we try to wrap, or what do you think?
Well, I'm going to push these out. I just wanted to call out, we had two folks that asked questions that we wanted to definitely cover. Marty, these are people that submitted early questions. Marty, I thought this question was great about a water utilities. So that you're dealing in, she's in water utilities. And the question was, how could I develop a way for people to use data collaboratively with the goal for them to adopt and embrace a new way to discontinue the old practice? So she's trying to design, I take this and I say, wow, Marty, it's such an interesting problem. And I'm glad because it follows on the heels of that answer, like, hey, design thinking can be used for process. This is a process. And I think what's interesting is you should approach this as, do some of the work that David did. I would say design thinking 101 is go out and ask your peers, ask them what kind of challenges they're having getting to, decisions in the organization, what kind of challenges they're having with people's understanding of data, what kind of challenges they're having, how they're feeling about results. You'll gain some insights and then frame up your effort, I think, is to design a new process inside of the company. So a great example is sort of a more advanced example, which I love we're covering. Use the input from emotion, frame up a different challenge, and then actively try running a meeting differently. Jeremy had mentioned this, that a lot of times some of the output we get is, how do I run this meeting differently? And that meeting is a chance to design, and it's a thing that can be designed just like, the treadmill device. So approach it as, how do I gather more input? I think I can tell a frustration. I want to change this old practice. Well, gather input from employees, understand their emotional needs, understand the challenges they're having, build some problem statements around that, and then try some prototyping. And then the other one I wanted to cover. Do you want to cover this one, Jeremy? That's such a great, interesting topic.
Go right ahead.
Okay. Nair from Glendale. This is an interesting product. I could use it for my COVID times. It's a sensorized shoe insole that measures your weight. So Jeremy, at different times of COVID, let's be honest, Jeremy, we've had some problems with donuts, both of us at different times.
I've had a few donut excursions. That's true.
Yeah. So we want to provide one stress-free metric, which will provide happiness and holistic feedback on how to increase activity and improve wellness. Should it be binary? Am I doing good or not? Or should it be a more detailed report with all of the metrics? So I have no idea, and I think you're asking this because it's the instinct to have no idea. And the answer is, this would be a fabulous thing. The previous project as well as fabulous projects for design thinking. I think it'd be so interesting to understand, not about the metric. That's not, if you focus on what's the metric, but I think what's so interesting is, what do people want to know about their health? I mean, Perry's joking about donuts, but there's actually something I would love to interview on this and be interviewed about. What are my needs? What are my concerns about my health on a daily basis? Particularly in the world we're living in now, where I'm standing in the same, square meter here for the whole day. How am I feeling about my health? What are some potential, things? Tell me about I'm going to ask a question. Tell me about the last time you thought about your health while you're standing in front of the screen. And how do you address it? Tell me that story. You could do all kinds of really fun interviews and get some insights and get some challenges, and then potentially deliver different types of information prototypes, so different types of answers on metrics and information to these individuals, and get a sense of how they react to them. And I wouldn't approach this as the one thing in the question I think it's interesting to call out is looking for an answer. I think early on, I would look for, how do I create a portfolio of potential dashboards of information? How do I create dozens that I could show users? That might be a mindset to take on at the very beginning, that I'm not going to get to the answer. I'm going to get to a bunch of different potential creative answers, put them in front of users, and I'm going to continue to learn and eventually get to a subset that we want to put out as product. So that, Jeremy, I think we have just a couple minutes to cover that last bit of content.
Yeah, I would say the one thing that I would mention just before we've got a couple of slides we wanted to wrap with, but one thing that I wanted to mention is it's very important to realize conventional wisdom is often right and sometimes wrong. And in many organizations, like you saw it with Ray, right, there is a conventional paradigm. You know, 1905 is known as the miracle year. I don't know if you're aware of this, but it's when Einstein wrote his groundbreaking works on relativity. What's interesting is in 1900, just 5 years earlier, Lord Kelvin had reported to the British Association for the Advancement of Science, there is nothing new to be discovered in physics now. All that remains is more and more precise measurement. And he was the world authority in physics, right? Which is to say what? Even the experts, even world-renowned experts, are sometimes wrong. And it takes a little bit of naivete. It takes a little bit of fresh perspective. It takes a bit of a beginner's mindset to challenge convention. And you shouldn't expect to challenge convention and not experience resistance. There's a reason it's convention. Conventional wisdom is usually right. But challenging it oftentimes leads to unexpected breakthroughs. We've seen it across industries, from arts to science to law even. Challenging conventions is a really great way to do it, but don't expect to be a resistance-free path. There will be resistance there. Just as we wrap, one of the things hopefully that you identified in all of our answers to these questions is we don't have the answers. We are not answer guys. We are approach guys. And design thinking itself isn't an answer, it's an approach. And what we would say is, be thoughtful about your approach. And we can coach individuals on the approach, but I love, like Nara's question, who knows if it should be binary, right? But you know what Perry basically advised her is, define the outcome variable, meaning what are you hoping somebody does? Check back again tomorrow, share on social media, whatever it is, right? Define the outcome variable, and then do both of those things and see which one impacts your outcome variable in the most desirable way. Wow, when I make it binary, all of a sudden, people's engagement goes through the roof, right? Or when I give a detailed report, it does, right? But we're advocating an approach, and the approach that we advocate is one where we're mindful of the questions that are driving our action. A lot of people talk about the miracle year, Terry, just so you know, it's called the miracle year. But I'm trying to watch chat and talk at the same time. I wouldn't recommend it. I'm like a cow that has multiple stomachs, except with my brain, I guess. And I'm randomly thinking of metaphors while doing this. My point is, design thinking isn't only action. A lot of people think about design thinking, they hear bias towards action, and it could just be this frivolous, random, set of flurry of activity. What we advocate is thoughtful, deliberate action, where we know we're not going to know the answer until we act. So action is a must. But what action we take is informed by thoughtful inquiry, and we call it inquiry-driven design. And I'll just finish by saying, if you think about what's the question, how do I know which bucket to draw from? You've got to be able to answer a couple of questions. One is, what's our big unknown? And I've got this here. Unfortunately, the On24, someone mentioned On24 needs to be redesigned. That's funny. But it's a simple wheel where we can say, okay, what's my big unknown? Do I not know the problem I'm trying to solve? Okay, good. Or do I not know, the answer to the problem I've identified, right? So what's our big unknown? And then what kind of thinking is going to help us make progress? Do we need to be, so once I say, okay, I'm on the blue, right? Now, do I need to be, making decisions, or do I need to be generating options, right? And if I say I need to be making decisions, great. Then where do I need to be drawing tools from? Well, I should probably be drawing tools from that converge on the solution bucket. Oh, well, I know these several tools to converge on solutions. Here's what's kind of behind those sliders there, are these questions basically. But when we talk about the process of design, we're not just talking about action, and we're not just talking about a sequence or a prescription or a recipe. We're talking about a thoughtful, inquiry-led approach to taking action in order to address uncertainty, both on the solutions that we're imagining side and also on the problems we are attempting to solve side. So this is how we think about process. Hopefully this has been a demystifying experience for you. Our goal is to make these tools and these mindsets accessible to somebody in product development, and somebody in HR, and somebody in accounting. Wherever it is, we believe that we can bring more rigor, more fun, and better problem solving to whatever role you might play in your organization, whatever industry your organization might be in. And we hope the tools we've shared today just whet your appetite a little bit. There's no way to go in deeply into the tools, but that's what the online programs are for. There's an amazing set of resources and tools in these programs, and we're excited to see how you use them not only to impact your work, but also to change your life and to change the world. We wish you all the best of luck.
And Jeremy, in your wrap, you didn't lose anybody. 682 of you are still here. So anyway, awesome. And we mean what we say. We are passionate about these tools being out there and you using them, and we love hearing from you with hard questions or, these amazing, some people are sharing, if you can see all the questions, sharing how they've used some of these tools. And we just find that fascinating, and it keeps us hard at work. So thank you. And thank all of you for the amazing questions. We love it. I wish we could get to all of them. We have done our best, but thank you so much.
Perry and Jeremy, that was great. And everyone who's here with us today, the engagement was just so fabulous. It really felt like a personal one-on-one conversation, and I just really love that dynamic. Also, when you guys submit questions or expand on something, that gives us great insight about where we need to go next, so the content that we can produce and answer these. So that was really helpful, and thanks so much for joining us today. And we're gonna sign off from Stanford. Thanks, Perry. Thanks, Jeremy.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a great day,
Bye,
everyone.
everybody.